Hello, I am John. In this video, my buddy James and I investigate a number of claims that Carl Benjamin makes about the Western liberal tradition. This is the kickoff episode of a podcast that we intend on operating in partnership with Atheists For Liberty. We call it Heirs of Fire. Enjoy.
How are you?
I am well. How are you doing?
Doing very, very well. It's come to my attention we have some pressing matters to attend to today.
Yeah, so we're here to discuss the Sargon interview with Lauren Chen. That is my understanding.
Yes, sir. Yeah, and what a fun show that was, because we all know how well that went for everybody.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned to you before, I think that his entire argument essentially boils down to three core contentions. That one, communism is downstream from and thereby the necessary conclusion of the liberal tradition. That two, the Judeo-Christian ethos are somehow a necessary foundation of Western civilization. And that three, tradition, whatever that means, is somehow a suitable substitute.
Yes. Yes, and with that in mind, I kind of want to take this one at a time. I think it'd be in our best interest to do that.
Well, I mean, how do you want to approach this? You want to watch the video and then comment on the things that they're saying?
Yes, I think we should go through the video. We should sort of break down the misconceptions, and then I definitely also wanted to talk about his misunderstanding of Locke, because he has a fundamental loss of. He loses the thread so many times in terms of discussing Lockean ideals, I think, and that's important to note.
I would definitely agree. I think that is, I think that is entirely that hits the nail on the head, and I think in a lot of ways. He fundamentally makes the error of wrapping all the liberal ideologies into one, essentially acting as if, Rousseau is like a necessary consequence of Locke, which I don't think is the case. But I think, as we'll see, we'll have plenty of we'll have plenty of meat and potatoes to deal with here. So yes. I guess I'll share my screen.
Yeah, go ahead.
God, Carl Benjamin, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. I didn't realize this was an inaugural episode of anything.
Yeah,
on our website than to simply turn off our Patreon or turn off our YouTube ad revenue or whatever it is. And so
I do appreciate that. Being through like osmosis, my daughter can grow up just now. I think some people watching this might be surprised to hear your take.
Before I begin, you have to forgive me, people listening, because I've been a bit ill over the weekend, and I'm just coming off the end of it. So if I'm separate from liberalism,
let's see. I want to get to where he starts.
I think it's directly downstream from
yes, and then just
okay, right here.
This.
Yeah, like right about here.
So, where to begin? I challenged James Lindsay's claim that communism is entirely separate from liberalism. I don't think it is. I think it's directly downstream from liberalism because, well, genealogically, that's how the philosophy goes. The problem stems from a promise that liberalism makes at the very foundational level. All of the early liberals, from about 1628 to around 1750, if not slightly later, premise liberalism on the thought experiment of the state of nature. Now, to some, they realized that this probably wasn't the case, but we could assume that it was for further conclusions. But others actually thought this was really how man was. Now, what the state of nature is supposed to have been is a theoretical pre-social state that man lives in. So that's man before he lives in a society, before he lives with other men. And so before people are reliant on one another. And so all of the philosophers, or proto-liberal philosophers, have their own take on what man was like in the state of nature. Now, you've got people like Grotius and Hobbes who looked at that and said, well, hang on a second. If man is in a pre-social state of nature, then, as Hobbes famously coined it, his life will be nasty, brutish, and short. It's slightly different to that, but that's the way it comes out.
So feel free to tell me to stop it if you think we should stop it.
Yes, yeah, I think so far there's a lot of build-up. I noticed that he does this, and we'll sort of talk about this as the video plays out, but he has to abstract liberal principles so much to actually make them fundamentally compatible with not just like a collective ethic, but communism in and of itself. I think that's one of his biggest shortcomings. I don't know if you would agree with me on that, but I think he has to begin to abstract in order to make the two connect. And I think that's pretty evident given the way that he builds up the case and then how he walks you through it over the course of the video.
Yeah, I mean, his claim, that communism is, directly downstream from liberalism. He says, genealogically, as if that's, somewhat or somehow meaningful. When I think genealogy, I just think of descendants, right? But simply because, one thing came after the other thing, that doesn't mean that it came from that thing, or that it is, or with regards to ideas, that it entails a preservation of what made those ideas meaningful. I mean, I don't think that communism is directly downstream from liberalism logically and antecedently. Where like liberalism is some sort of an antecedent to communism.
Yes.
It's true that, socialistic schools of thought, branched off of the liberal tradition, making use of what they thought were the consequences of certain arguments. Like, for example, Rousseau's argument, and this is actually one thing I like about Sargon, is later in this video, he does point out that Rousseau essentially blames property for all equality, and thereby for all suffering and injustice in history. But the difference, though, is that Rousseau doesn't advocate for abolishing property because Rousseau thought now we're at the point where it was necessary. Whereas essentially the socialistic and then eventually the really communist schools of thought, they definitely do advocate for the abolition of property.
Yes.
They take the argument like a step further. I guess my main contention with Sargon is not that. I do think that Rousseau's reasoning does lend itself towards a socialistic interpretation when you take it to its logical conclusion.
Yes.
But I do not think that we can characterize all of the liberal tradition as Rousseauianism.
Well, that is fundamentally the issue, is that you can throw Rousseau categorically. You can throw him into the liberal school. You could. However, it would be better to rely upon Locke, because Locke is by definition the father and arbiter of liberalism. So, in my opinion, to even throw Rousseau into the box is somewhat of an abstraction where you don't need to make that step. I think that's I think that's just a sort of pointless thing to say. You know what I mean? I don't know if you would agree with that, but. Me primarily, I remember watching this to its fullest extent, and not just reacting to the one bit that I had reacted to earlier with Thomas. That was one of the things that stuck out to me, was that, yes, he makes his critique of Rousseau, but is that even important when discussing the social contract? Because his main gripe is with Lockean liberal ethics. And Rousseau does sort of step away from the Lockean ideal. So...
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing, is rejecting Locke on the basis of Rousseau seems kind of illogical. Exactly. It really sounds like you'd have to actually grapple with what Locke's argument is, because for Locke's equality, Locke's state of nature, almost everything about Locke's philosophy is very different from Rousseau's interpretation of what the state of nature or equality are. So it's these are very different philosophers. Yes. So essentially being like, because Rousseau leads to collectivism, socialism, and communism, therefore we must reject Locke. I mean, that doesn't really make very much sense to me.
No, and I think another thing that Carl might be falling into a trap here with, I'd be interested to see if this is the case, and I'm sure in future we might get this from him. But there are instances where things like certain collectivist systems, let's say democratic socialism, can be made to work with certain liberal principles. Not all of them, but certainly a lot of social liberal principles and the ideas of free speech and free association that can be connected and attached to certain.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely also discuss that a little further as well.
Yes, which I want to, right? But when and I'm sure you see where I'm going with this. One of the things I'm wondering is if he's noting that, and if that is of a concern, because it is in fact somewhat symbiotic.
Yeah. All right, let's continue. Let's continue watching the video, shall we?
Yes, please. Yeah.
All righty.
In most dialogue, when people are referencing it. And so, I mean, that's probably true. If man's left in a forest on his own to scratch for his own survival, his life is going to be quite rough. And this puts men in a state of war against all. Because if any man happens to have killed a deer or something, and he's carrying around a chunk of deer, well, then any other man might kill him and take it, right? And so every man has to be suspicious of every man. And so for Hobbes in particular, the reason that we enter into society is to protect ourselves and our property from the depredations of our fellow man. And we do that by overawing them with a higher power, which is the state. And this is why the state, in his view, is justified as being absolute. And then you had more thought development on this until you got to John Locke. And he thought the state of nature actually was kind of bifurcated into two different ways. On one hand, it was the state of reason, in which everyone just calmly plows their own furrow of land and builds their own little huts. And the common reason of mankind will make every man think, oh, well, I should live like that, and that's fine. But some of mankind don't, and they are in the state of war because they're trying to steal your stuff. And so men sacrifice a portion of their rights in order to guarantee their property. And that's all well and good until
So I'd actually like to stop here because while Carl is very accurate here, I would like to point out that you do not necessarily when reading Locke, one does not necessarily have to interpret Locke's claims as meaning that you sacrifice your rights. If anything, actually, a more convincing account of the state of civil society is that it was for the purpose of preserving rights, right? It was because in the state of individuals together in the state of nature didn't want to be subject to the depredations of others. And, and in this context, the state of being subject to the depredations of others is the state of having your rights violated. So to preserve their rights, they enter into a state of civil society. That in my mind, that does not constitute a sacrifice of rights. And if anything, Locke goes further in the second treatise to talk about how whenever a portion of that civil society seeks to strip the rights of the individual, essentially what they're doing is they've dissolved the civil society and entered into a state of war against those individuals. And so, which is why Locke argues that there can be no state of civil society with a monarch, because a monarch is necessarily in the state of war against his people, because there is no appeal against the monarch other than the appeal to the sword.
Yes, and which your interpretation of the second treatise is 2,000% correct. It's been a while since I've cracked open the second treatise of government, but I am well acquainted with it. One of the things that I do think is worth throwing out there, in terms of how Carl is putting the reference to the sacrifice of rights, and I think you and I have discussed this before previously, John, and you kind of said that, but I'll say it in my own words. When you enter into a social situation and you realize that, let's say, you don't have the absolute right to do anything, let's say, that does not equate to a sacrifice of the right to be free, because you've entered into an agreement under the idea that you might sacrifice the perceived state of being free for the guaranteed right, for the guarantee of other rights that could be available to you. And
I mean, that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, and it's the safeguarding of those as a group, which sounds strange talking about Locke. That is important. You have to enter into that agreement. That is what I mean. That's almost definitionally why it's called the social contract.
Well, I mean, that agreement not to prey upon one another, that is the state of civil society. Essentially, that's what it means, which is actually why I very much prefer Locke's state of civil society to Rousseau's social contract, because in Rousseau's formulation, you do, in fact, quit your natural rights and you trade them in exchange for civil rights. I think that the whole purpose of civil society is the preservation of your natural or moral rights. And so, therefore, our civil rights should essentially be nothing but reflections of our natural rights, if that makes sense. I don't really think you quit your autonomy in this way.
Yeah, no, it's much more of a, it's not the destruction of a set of rights, it's the coming together for the preservation of a set of rights. And the expression of those rights as well.
Yeah, at least that's the way I interpret Locke. And being very much a Lockean myself, of course, I agree with the guy.
Oh, yeah, I would imagine so. I'd hope so. Otherwise, you might be an interesting Lockean right there.
Yeah, but actually, this Lauren says something later here. I think it was Lauren that said it. It might have been Carl, though. One of them says something along the lines of, there's no chance of like a resurgence of Lockean liberalism. And I think that using this hopeless throw your hands up in the air of, Lockean liberalism will never come back, therefore, because all the liberalisms that are left are just, the walking meat suit zombie corruptions of liberalism that exist. Because of that, therefore, we just need tradition, which I mean...
Is that not inherently nihilistic of him as well? Both of them.
Yeah. I guess we could probably explore that more when we actually cross that bridge.
Yes, yeah, but I can't wait to get to that part because that's one of my favorite parts of the entire video. Yeah.
Alrighty.
Slightly later on, Rousseau looked at this and said, well, you're not really representing man as he would be in a state of nature, because you haven't stripped away the social aspects of what it is to be a human being and got down to the absolute core, which is essentially the indivisible universal man. So before a society, a man doesn't have language, he doesn't have customs, he doesn't have habits, he doesn't have lots of illnesses that are the product of society, like gout and things like that, the product of a rich diet and things like this. You don't have social status. Everyone is perfectly free and perfectly equal. And so that is what the early liberal thinkers were trying to return to. And Rousseau is the one who makes this the most explicit, but they're all clear about this. What you want is to be able to protect yourself and your property as if you're in the state of nature. And Rousseau,
so he's making a fundamental error here in that he's both miscategorizing Rousseau's state of nature and all the other liberal thinkers' state of nature at the same time by trying to conflate them all as one. For Rousseau, there is no property in the state of nature. No. And so because of that, how can the state of nature be for Rousseau the preservation of property? It's in his mind, the creating of property was what took man out of the state of nature.
Yes. It was the inherent basis for inequality. I wonder if that's just a misunderstanding by Carl, or maybe he misspoke there. I would like to think that, because I know Carl's read Locke. I know he has in the past. I did a search into his old, I remember he used to read passages out of Locke in 2014 and 15. So I know he has experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, the man can read Locke, though, and not necessarily understand him. I mean, he clearly has a lot of misconceptions about Locke as well, because he later claims that Locke wanted Catholicism to be illegal. I mean, and Locke, I read Locke's letter concerning toleration, as well as his essay concerning toleration. Interestingly enough, there's two of them. One is lesser known than the other. And in both of them, he basically says that he's met plenty of papists who were perfectly kind and, moral people, and that he would not at all want for them to be stripped of their right to worship as they saw fit. The only caveat was that Locke did not think that the Catholic Church of the time could be tolerated because it was a fundamentally intolerant institution.
Yes.
And but and tolerating the organization versus tolerating, the worship are two very different things.
Yep.
So
just for anybody who's going to make the comment that that's impossible, which I'm sure somebody will, we do it today consistently, all the time. Ruin, you and I as atheists do this frequently, but also, I mean, especially in terms of in political terms, there are so many times where you could say, like, there are plenty of nice Democrats or plenty of nice Republicans, but we don't support the institution in and of itself. Yeah. It's not a difficult distinction to draw.
We could go even more extreme, right? Where, I mean, we tolerate Muslims in our country, but that doesn't mean we're going to tolerate ISIS.
Exactly.
The organization is going to hunt them down and exterminate them, right?
Yes. And in fact, when he says that Catholicism should be illegal and they should be thrown in jail, because I'm pretty sure that's almost verbatim what he says. I know he says it's illegal. I'm not too sure about the thrown in jail part. I'm pretty sure he does mention that, though. I remember that gave me immediate pause the first time I heard it, like 3 months ago, because or you hadn't read anything on Locke and toleration in particular, because a simple Google search would have proved him wrong.
Yeah.
And I was a little bit concerned with that because I guess I'm contradicting myself here. I know he has read Locke, and I know you said that doesn't mean he has to understand Locke, which is true. But then it makes me wonder if he's engaging in good faith with people's perceptions of these materials and how people have read them.
I don't know. I mean, that would be some... Yeah, I honestly don't know. I cannot claim to understand the inner working of the man's mind. But what I do know is that it's fascinating how his political transformation, and he has undergone a political transformation.
Yes.
Some people in the comments here I read the comments here, and some people were saying, oh, well, he hasn't changed, actually. It's just the left that kept moving left.
No.
It's like, no, he has ideologically transformed. He did not used to be a proponent of traditionalism for traditionalism's sake. He was once a classical liberal. So that and those two things are not really all that compatible with each other.
In fact, at one point, I would argue. I mean, he for a while. I mean, he was a classical liberal. He was, unlike Dave Rubin, in my opinion, he was the true example of what a classical liberal should be. Carl Benjamin was. But I would even argue that even early on in his career, he was almost a bit of a social liberal too. Because there are early videos of him discussing the principled idea for state handouts and collectivized systems of healthcare, collectivized systems.
Oh, yeah. I remember one of his videos from many years ago where he criticized libertarianism, talking about how, and I don't remember what specific video this was, but he was talking about how, no man is an island and whatnot. So he definitely was not 100% a fellow traveler, I guess, more with attitudes that would be more compatible with mine. I'm more libertarian leaning in that regard. Not that I believe that any man is an island, actually. This is one of the things I really love about Locke, because Locke actually does a very good job. I think his paradigm works very well in retaining the individual sovereignty while making an account for how individuals can work together in collectively, which you need both. That's not to say that ultimately, I think the problem is that too many liberal thinkers went on because we need to know how to build a society, we're going to start sacrificing more and more of the individual rights for the sake of the general will or the public good or the will of the people and things like that. And eventually liberalism lost all connection to its original foundation, in my opinion.
Yes, and just an interesting point about Carl, because I didn't growing up, I was a huge Sargon fan. I never called myself conservative. I always called myself a classical liberal because I learned about the distinctions between the two and how there are lots of connecting points. But even back in 2016, when I would argue that American conservatism and classical liberalism are much closer, back then, there were still incredibly important points where they fundamentally did not see eye to eye. subjugation to tradition being one of them, subjugation to religion being another. You know, and I think that's very important to note. But one of the things that I do find somewhat comical is I remember there was a video of Carl's where he essentially said that classical liberalism was the equivalent of libertarianism with a boundary. It was libertarianism with a boundary and a stopping point, which was a great, you know, comeback back when I was 15. But as I've gotten older, and as we'll probably see in this video, it also makes me wonder about how long has he had some of these misinterpretations of Locke. Because I would argue that libertarian ideology and liberal ideology, there are some differences, but they're so minute that saying that one is inherently different from the other is kind of a misnomer.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I mean, libertarianism, I think there's a much better argument for the idea that libertarianism is what's downstream from liberalism, not communism. It's because it all depends on what specific version of liberalism you're talking about. Again, to be nuanced, it all depends on what specific value you're looking to maximize. Libertarianism is the at least American right libertarianism. I'll be specific. Is basically what happens when you take John Locke and you try and maximize the idea of individual liberty. Whereas I guess one could argue that the whole wokeism and DEI cult and all that stuff was what happens when they started taking the idea of equality and equity further and further and further until they started maximizing it at the expense of liberty. And in that way, you can say that those ideologies are somewhat, you know, they are descended genealogically from the liberal tradition. But does that mean that they're really, you know, heirs or torchbearers of the idea? I mean, what's the name liberalism is all about liberty. The idea, equality for Locke was for the purpose of freeing man. For him, equality was an equality with regards to a jurisdiction of one man over the life of another. So for him, his version of equality was all about liberty. Liberty was the primary value there.
Yeah, if we want to continue with the video, we definitely can. I want to be able to get into the meat of this. We are
waffling about it, aren't we?
Yes, but I'm more charging myself up. I know there's about to be mistakes made, so let's get into it.
Therefore comes to the formulation that, yeah, actually everyone needs to be totally dependent on the state, because instead of sacrificing some of your rights, you in fact exchange all of your rights, and in return, your natural rights, and in return you get civil rights. And these civil rights are whatever the state decrees them to be, and the state has total power over whether you are entitled to something or not. Now, Rousseau was still in this sort of original liberal tradition, even though you can see how this has morphed from Locke's view that actually your rights are natural, but you sacrifice some of them to the state in order to get protection. Whereas Rousseau has taken this and said, no, you sacrifice all of them, and then the state gives you what you want, what you get. So the state takes on nature itself. It becomes nature and is the provider of all things. But Rousseau, in his perfect utopia, he thought that everyone would be a small landowner. So he thought that everyone would essentially be sort of a sort of petty bourgeois shopkeeper or smallholder or cobbler or something like this. And so everyone would just do their own work and own a little patch of land or a single building or something like that. And everyone would live in a state of constant political awareness, where you would go to a public gathering, like in ancient Athens, you'd go to Pnyx and you'd have your say in democracy, and via the vote, the general will of the entire state would be revealed, and politics would continue on like this. Now, that is kind of true in the liberal view, right? That is. If you were to assume that man began in the state of nature and you were going to construct a state that would essentially replicate the state of nature and create a world in which you could live in society in the state of nature, Rousseau is the most correct on that argument, because his argument is, well, in the state of nature, man is not dependent on himself, on one another at all. They are most dependent on the state. And he literally just explicitly says we should be extremely entirely dependent on the state and not dependent on one another. So, okay, well, that's true, because in Rousseau's view, vanity is a consequence of society. We look at each other and we want to be looked at in return. We want people to appraise us and to value us and to regard us. And this is where social rank and hierarchy come in. And if you have ever used Twitter, you know that's exactly true. That's exactly true. That's what people are like in a society. But the thing that the liberals have to kind of concede, and science and archaeology have absolutely confirmed these things, is that there was no such thing as a pre-social man. Man has always lived in a society. Rousseau gives the example of monkeys and wolves as to how man can live outside of society. And they're social animals. They live in groups, just like chimpanzees and gorillas. And like, I don't know why he gives the example of social animals to bolster his point on that. But the point being, man has never lived alone. And you can look at all the archaeological record. It's small family groups, sort of tribes, clans, you know, like a few dozen people living together. There was never a pre-social man. And so that presupposition was just wrong. But it is also wrong to suggest that that pre-social man has property. That pre-social man does not have property, which is why he comes into society in the first place. That's why, for Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau, men come together to protect that thing that they have built up with their own labor. And so Karl Marx is not wrong to say, oh, you promised liberty and equality. And in fact, in the pre-social state of nature, these things were one and the same.
So I think what we need to explore is what even is property, because, or even what is the state of nature, because again, you know, Locke's essentially arguing that people, in order to, you know, protect their property and their person, they enter into the state of nature, whereas Rousseau felt that, well, actually, you leave the state of nature once you acquire property. Sargon's basically taking Rousseau's interpretation of the state of nature and running with it, essentially just asserting that Locke and Hobbes were wrong. Also, essentially, he said Rousseau was wrong, but the fact of the matter is Rousseau's interpretation was exactly what he just said.